Good afternoon. This is Dave Stargel of the Complex Sale. I'd like to welcome you to our June webinar. Today's topic is UnSelling, sell less to win more. Very, very interesting and intriguing topic. I think everyone today is looking for ways to differentiate themselves, and I think today's topic is going to help salespeople in particular to differentiate themselves, not just their solution, how they bring more value to the selling effort and the conversations by taking a different approach. Today's speaker is Peter Bourke, one of our senior principals with the Complex Sale. He's written an ebook on this topic, and so stay with us to the end, and we're going to tell you how to get a copy of that ebook for free. Our host today, most of you probably know from working with him or previous webinars, is Rick Page, our CEO and founder and author of the best-selling Hope Is Not a Strategy, and he's going to discuss and walk Peter through what is this unselling topic, selling less to win more. One quick logistical thing, we know you may have a lot of questions on this topic, so if you would, type your questions into the question box, and we're going to try to allow enough time at the end to address all of those. We may not get to all of them, so if you would like to have a follow-up on your question, if we don't get to it, just add that to the question when you type it in, and we'll be sure to make sure that Peter or Rick or both follow up with you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick for today's topic.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. As David mentioned, we're going to introduce a new concept today, and this is based on a published ebook written by Peter Bourke, and also about 30 years of sales experience here. And I've seen some of the best salespeople I've ever seen use this technique, but this is the first time I think anybody's ever captured it and documented it and put it into certainly an ebook. So it's a concept that for experienced salespeople really going to shatter some paradigms and some traditional training that we've had, because it's really counterintuitive. And it takes a little bit of courage to try this the first time, and when you see it work, as David mentioned, it really can differentiate you from salespeople and position yourself as more of a strategic consultant with your clients. And so with that, the title of it is UnSelling, Sell Less to Win More. And Peter, how did you come up with this title? It's provocative.
I appreciate the time and the opportunity to address this group, Rick. The notion of unselling actually comes from the old 7-Up. And I'm kind of a product of the 70s, and those who are old enough on the phone to remember when 7-Up was actually in a pretty big promotion mode. They had this whole Un-Cola kind of advertising scheme. And the notion of Un-Cola was basically it was a beverage, but it wasn't really a cola. And in the same way, I've met many, many salespeople who actually are uncomfortable with the notion of the traditional selling techniques and strategies they've been taught since they came out of college, and would prefer a more collaborative approach. And so that's what we're really introducing, is the notion of creating a way to sell and serve clients that isn't traditional selling.
Okay, so some people that know us might know that Peter and I first met when he was leading worldwide business development at Accenture in the 90s, and he hired us, TCS, to work with them. And I know, Peter, a lot of this comes from your experience, and especially your Accenture experience with some of the business developers there. Can you help everybody understand where this approach and concept itself comes from?
Absolutely. In fact, there's really kind of three dimensions that are the genesis of where this comes from. One is, when I joined Accenture in 1994, one of the things I was struck by is some of the most experienced and successful of the business development rainmakers actually didn't use traditional selling techniques. They did a great job of collaborating, they did a great job of adding value, and they even challenged the client's perspective, but they didn't use what you'd think of as closing techniques, sign hard, 3 copies, trial closes, and those kinds of things. So a lot of experience, and most of the work I've done for the last 20 years has been in those consulting, outsourcing, kind of large, high-tech environments. The second dimension is win and loss reviews. We initiated, institutionalized the concept of following a key either win or loss at Accenture. We would hire a third party to actually go face-to-face interview 2 or 3 key executives following the deal in order to get firsthand perspective on why they chose who they chose and what were the dynamics, because the reality is they don't tell the sales team the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The third dimension in this whole equation is, as you know, Rick, ever since I've joined the complex sale and even prior to that, I've been coaching large deal teams on what to do, how to do it, and how to win more than their fair share. And so it's all three of those dimensions that kind of combine for this concept of unselling.
Okay, Peter, it's new and it's helpful, especially with people who don't consider themselves traditional salespeople. One of the things we've done to help them get rid of old images of salespeople is to take that away. We've helped with consultants and people who have found themselves like account managers in a sales role and never thought they'd be in one. We defined it as solving and serving, and that's helped people a lot understand really what repeat business is all about. So if you could share some of the highlights and the key headlines, what you've learned from the client executive on these win-loss reviews you've done over the years.
And I think that's a great place to start, Rick, because it gives you a bit of the context as to what's going on. And I'd like to do it kind of in two quick steps. One is overall observations from all three of those dimensions of coaching and win and loss reviews and the whole having been around consulting people for a long time. Let me share a few headlines that are here on this slide. One is I have been struck over the years about the notion of the best solution not winning most of the time. In fact, most workshops that I conduct, I always ask the group, what percentage of the time do you think that the best solution actually wins if you were really, truly objective? And the majority of time, people would say, well, less than 50%. Second thing that's been striking to me is, and we've all seen these RFPs that come out, and you're asked to respond in 4 days, and you can't access any people, and you can't get any information. Well, what we've learned from the School of Hard Knocks is RFPs are not designed to choose the best solution. They're designed predominantly to help the client prove that whoever they intended to choose in the first place ultimately gets chosen. And when you deal with that reality, it has massive implications for how we sell. Another striking thing to me, kind of in an overall context, is how often what I call the dreaded do nothing ends up being the choice that the client makes. And if we can't figure out as professional selling, consultative, kind of collaborative selling people how to do a better job of figuring out whether or not the client is likely to do anything at all, then we're probably going to miss some key opportunities. And then the last one, kind of in this overall context, is the client is actually motivated in many cases to mislead us. And unless we're a healthy skeptic about that notion, then we sometimes kind of get lulled into this sense of complacency that everything's going great because the client is making us and every other competitor believe that they're in really good shape. So with that as kind of a backdrop, let me share with you probably the big headlines around the notion of, and David, if you could advance one, around the notion of what I call the narrow line between winning and losing. And I won't cover all of these, but let me share a couple of key ones. One is you have to recognize that when a sales team goes to a client to debrief after a key pursuit, and they say to the client executive, well, why did we lose in this example? More often than not, the client has been trained to say, well, it was really a price issue. And the reason they say price is because it's kind of the indefensible answer, if you will. And what's fascinating is as I go and conduct these face-to-face interviews, and I go in there basically saying, I want to understand the truth. I'm not going to try to defend the organization I'm representing or anything else. I just want to know the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's usually never price related. So kind of fascinating when you get to that. Look at the third one. It says, relying on the solution to win. I can't tell you how many times I've seen organizations, teams, basically assume that if I have the best solution and I do a better job of articulating the solution to a reasonably intelligent client, then I'm going to win most of the time. Well, the fact is, when you talk to executives, they have trouble differentiating one solution from another. And unless we understand that, we'll keep selling, we'll keep telling, and that typically is not nearly as effective as it would be otherwise. Let me just comment on one other one on this list, and that is the notion of the wrong account, the wrong opportunity. Another really thematic element of these win and loss reviews is when you do the debrief and you find out the whole truth, and then you go back to the team that was pursuing the deal and you tell them what the client told me. What you really figure out in more cases than you'd like to admit is that the client, my client, probably never should have pursued that particular opportunity in the first place. And if they'd have asked the right questions at the right stage of the process, they probably would have saved themselves a lot of time and a lot of money. So that's just kind of the headline to it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised by some of these findings. And to me, win-loss assessments are the silver bullets. I mean, how can you argue with clients?
Right.
Although you're exactly right, is that the sales reps, we used to do a win-loss assessment, and we'd ask the sales reps why you won or lost. They will always lose on price and product and win on superior salesmanship. I mean, we always start pre-printing. But you really have to have a third party to do these things. The other thing is, if you could go through this is really a way to differentiate yourself as a salesperson and not fall into the traps of dashing to the demo, close, close, close.
Right.
All those traditional things that we've learned. These executives have seen all that. They've heard all that. They're tired of PowerPoints, and they're weary of those things. And it's actually shocking to them to hear a salesperson talk like a strategic consultant sometimes.
That's exactly right. Well, let me just kind of overview then some of the key concepts that are contained in this ebook and this whole philosophy. And maybe the best way to start is to give you a couple of vignette examples of where I think unselling becomes so powerful and so obvious. The first example I'll give you, everybody on the phone, is when you walk into a clothing store, one of the first things that happens invariably is a salesperson, a customer service person, whatever they might call them, is going to dash over to you as you enter the door, and they always ask the same question: may I help you? Right? And every single time, at least for 1,000 people that I've probably told this story to, I ask them, well, what do you say when they say that? And the answer is always the same: no, just look it. And then there's this long pause, and in reality, the crazy thing about that vignette is you actually do need help. You actually would like to get somebody to serve you. The problem is when somebody's in selling mode or telling mode, we resist that temptation, and what I call the straight arm goes up. And as soon as they walk away 13 paces, then you kind of call them back over. Oh, you know, I could get some advice on where your men's ties are or whatever it might be. So that's one thing I want to have everybody keep in mind. A second one is, it says up there, key executive meetings. We've all been either on the selling side of the equation or on the what I'll call the executive side of the equation, where a salesperson or team comes in and says, boy, I really appreciate the hour you've allocated for me. I've got this 34-page presentation that I'd like to take you through. And if you're the executive and you see this 34-page deck dropped on the table, you start going through your mind about how in the world am I going to make sure that this meeting doesn't go 3 hours? What do I have to do to make sure it's over? And as you've said before, Rick, probably the first thing they're doing is grabbing their BlackBerry and putting a text into their executive assistant and saying, hey, in 15 minutes, I need you to come interrupt me.
Rescue me.
Yeah, rescue me, exactly right. So all of that to say, whether it's product demonstrations or executive meetings or buying a suit, the more you sell, the more somebody sells, the less inclined the buyer, the client in this case, is inclined to try to buy from you. So let's kind of fast forward and talk about some basic philosophies, some guiding principles, and then I want to dive into 4 of the 22 strategies that we've captured in this ebook. First, let me help everybody understand a few key concepts. The more you sell, the less the client trusts you. And if you keep the examples that I've already shared with you in mind, I think it'll resonate with you. The more you sell, the less the client shares and the less they listen. Go back to the executive example. If I know you're going to cover 34 slides in the next 59 minutes, one of the strategies I might employ is, well, I'm going to be perfectly quiet, and I'm going to make sure I don't ask any questions, because otherwise I run the risk of getting far too, into what it is they want to cover.
It became 2 hours.
That just became 2 hours is right. And the more we're perceived as a hammer looking for a nail. I think that's death for a consultative sales or consulting kind of person, is when they feel like you have an answer, and regardless of what the problem is, you're going to deliver their answer. I think you shut down communications, you shut down trust, and that's one of the basic premises of this concept. Now, take it from another standpoint. Let's look at some guiding principles. So if you embrace this notion, I would challenge everybody on the phone to think through a few things and ask yourself the question, am I guilty of some of these? Or am I doing this in the right kind of unselling way? First, I believe that above all else, the client deserves the truth. And that says we have to be willing to genuinely tell them the truth. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into some of the examples as we go down. The second thing I would tell you is bad news early is good news. And Rick, for years and years, you've been espousing this concept that if you don't find the bad news early in the process, you'll find the bad news late in the process.
Yeah, a lot of salespeople have happy years, and we're all trained on positive mental attitudes, so we keep it up. When in reality, salespeople get lied to the most, and if you get bad news early, you can either change your strategy or walk away at that point, which you can do early in the sale, but you can't do towards the end because they'll just say, see ya. They've got everything they need from you at that point. So there's a lot of salespeople that don't ask the tough questions at this point because it'll spoil a perfectly good forecast.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And here's a contrast I found with typical consulting professionals versus the average sales professionals. Consulting people were perfectly delighted to ask the brutally honest question and get the truth. And you ask sometimes salespeople, well, how come you didn't ask them the really hard question? And the honest answer is, I really didn't want the answer, right? Because to your point, it could ruin a perfectly good forecast. So another dimension, kind of a guiding principle about this is when we're pursuing new clients and new opportunities, above all else, we've got to keep the client's success as paramount. And as soon as we start shifting our orientation on how do I really focus on making sure I win, well, the reality is if you and the client, focus on their success, then the trust is built, the collaboration is there, the honesty is there, and I just think it serves us over the length of the relationship. And the last one I'll highlight on this particular page is, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to read, and at the risk of promoting another author's book, Patrick Lencioni is somebody I've been impressed with over time. And he's come out with a book recently called Getting Naked. Now, I could argue that's a lousy title for a book. But the reality
certainly provocative.
It's certainly provocative, exactly right, kind of like unselling. But one of the things Lencioni talks about in his book is the concept of just start helping. And the reason I bring it up and the reason it integrates well into this concept of unselling is some salespeople or teams will basically have a philosophy that says, boy, when we win this deal and they sign the contract, we're going to be able to add a lot of value. Well, Patrick Lencioni says, not so fast. Why don't we start adding value in the first meeting? If you have advice and counsel, if you have expertise, then start sharing it from the beginning. And again, I think that's very consistent with what we're going to talk about. Now, the last kind of transition, and I want to go to a concept that Rick introduced in the marketplace probably 20 years ago. And when I was at Accenture, this was probably one of the key things that helped me decide that I was going to hire the complex sale to help us in what became the fastest growth part of Accenture, is this concept of how do we use our leverage in the selling process. So if we go to the next slide and you take a look at this simple concept we love to call the Death Valley Sales Canyon. Now, let me explain the Death Valley Sales Canyon in about 90 seconds, okay? Now, first of all, I want you to think of yourself as a pilot going through a canyon. And one of the things you notice as you come in from left to right in the early part of the process, okay, is that the walls are wide and there's actually a lot of room to navigate relative to when you get in the later phases of the process. Now, here's the principle. We actually have leverage and we have the ability to navigate in the early part of the process for one significant reason, and that is the client needs us. Okay? Now, it's worth a pause. Please don't mishear what I'm saying. When I say the client needs us, that does not mean emphatically that they want us. It means that they need us, and they may need us for a check bid, they may need us for advice and counsel, they may need us to abuse us in the process. We don't know exactly why they need us. What I do know in many cases is that they need us and they don't necessarily want us. But the notion that they need us actually gives us leverage. It gives us power And it's the one stage in the entire buying and selling process where it's imperative that we capture that leverage and use it to our advantage to really be able to test whether or not they actually both need us and potentially they want us. Okay? So if you're with me so far, let me explain two other concepts and then we'll get into some depth. When they need us, I believe that's your one great opportunity in the early part of the process to do things like gaining access, influencing the process, gathering information, doing all the classic kinds of things that a great consultative selling professional or consulting person would do in the early part of the process. And the reality, what I'll call the ugly reality, is if they won't let you do any of those things, what they're demonstrating to you is they really don't want you, and they probably don't even need you that much. Or if they do need us, they need a proposal that gives them leverage to be able to negotiate effectively with whoever they intended to choose in the first place. So I guess that's kind of a fundamental concept to the Death Valley Sales Canyon. And of course, we could spend 2 hours on that concept, and we won't today. But let me leave it at that to say, if you embrace this notion, and I explained it in more depth in the ebook, you'll also find yourself changing the nature of the relationship between buyer and seller. And the unhealthy relationship I've never liked is that when we have what I call a subservient relationship between buyer and seller, okay? Or another way to say it would be the compliant relationship. And the classic compliant relationship is where the client says, jump, and the salesperson or team says, how high, Mr. Customer? And I think that's a really unhealthy relationship to have because it's not built on trust, it's not built on collaboration, it doesn't leverage the knowledge we have and all the things that we're going to talk about in more depth. Let me contrast a couple other things. On the left-hand side, in the compliant subservient, a lot of salespeople have an attitude, I'm going to do exactly what the client wants me to do. I'm going to comply. I'm going to follow directions. I'm going to let them lead the process. And the reality is, I believe we are under-leveraging, underutilizing our experience and our expertise in this process. And so much about this concept of unselling is figuring out how to shift this equation to where the client, instead of the client tells the seller what they think they should know, in this particular case, what we want the client to do is feel comfortable that they can tell us the whole truth and that they're not worried about when they tell us the whole truth and that they're very happy with an incumbent, that we're not going to get defensive, we're not going to get disparaging, we're not going to do any of the things that kind of the traditional salespeople sometimes are guilty of. And so you see some of the examples of the contrast between these concepts. Now, if everybody's with me so far, let me kind of advance one step forward because another thing I think would be useful for us to kind of talk about, and I would challenge everybody on this phone call, if you like the concept and you think you could adapt it well to your environment, I would challenge you to actually find ways, even create scripts that allow you to use these concepts in your environment. So I'm going to share with you some examples of what I've done in my background or what we do at the complex sale, or because this is kind of fundamental to the way we tend to think. We believe, Rick's been espousing this concept of controlling the process as opposed to letting the client control the process, because in reality we're actually better qualified to add value in that process and not be that subservient sales rep. But what it requires is a different kind of courage and confidence and a different language. Let me give you a couple of examples when I talk about different language. The one on the upper left says to the client, regardless of who or whom you choose. Now, that seems like a fairly innocuous statement. The reality is when you get comfortable saying that to prospects and clients, what you're basically communicating to them is you are relaxed about the notion that they actually could be seriously considering somebody other than you. And you're giving them permission to actually look, and you're actually inviting them to have an honest dialogue about the different alternatives that they're undoubtedly considering and those kinds of things. But that little statement, regardless of what you end up choosing, would it be helpful if, or it might be helpful if, and we can, again, I'm going to go through some examples of those as we go. But it's a little bit of a script that I think will help many people kind of embrace this notion of unselling. Let me shift to another one. The bottom left says, you may want to first determine if it makes sense to invest in a new solution at all. Now, I got to tell you, I've actually used this with some of my clients and even in some of the workshops I've conducted over time. And I've had situations where the head of sales, when I've said a statement like that, which I call a whiplash statement, a whiplash question, which basically means if you were to say that to a client and another of your sales team were with you in the call, the reason they'd have a whiplash is because they'd look at you so fast and basically say to themselves, what in the world are you saying? Are you trying to kill my deal? In reality, in many, many cases, the client is actually motivated to not do anything at all. And when we make a statement like that, one of the things you're inviting the client to do is to confess that that is one of their reasonable options. And the great thing about that concept is when you create a relationship that's built on that notion that we can talk about that, because in some cases the client's going to say, well, gosh, yeah, I actually do think it makes sense to consider whether we should do anything at all. I just didn't think you'd be willing to talk about it. Then you're creating a trust and a dialogue that a traditional selling, telling salesperson just won't do.
And Peter, as we've said before, CSO Insights research shows that in last year, 23.6% of all forecasted deals don't buy anything from anybody. So this is obviously something in the back of the client's mind that's liable to happen. And the worst outcome for a salesperson is not just losing, it's finishing second late. When you spend all your resources, and it depends on the strength of your pipeline, but the veterans who have a good pipeline would rather lose early or win early or not play. The second thing is this really differentiates you from salespeople, and because the first question any strategic consultant asks is, should we be doing this at all? Which is a really different question to come from the salesperson who says, have I got the answer for you? I got this hammer, and let me find a nail that fits it. So it really does set you above and apart from the rest of the sales world to approach it this way, and it makes you different.
I absolutely agree. In fact, a spin on that same theme, if you look at the bottom right side of this slide, it says, why would you switch from your current provider? Now there's a couple of ways any salesperson could deliver that question. And what I find that we'll call it the rookie salesperson, tends to go to the client in the qualifying stage and they'll say, well, are you open to considering other options? And of course, that's the simplest question in the world for the client to answer or the prospect to answer, because they say, well, of course we are, because that's why we invited you. The unselling approach is a very different twist on the same kind of a question. And instead of saying, are you open to looking at options, you'd say to the client, probably, I wish you could see my face with a little bit of a scowl on your face, and say, well, as I hear about your situation and your current incumbent, and you seem pretty happy, I guess the bigger question is, why would you switch? And then you just need to be quiet, because the client then has the burden to prove to you that they're actually either unhappy enough with their current provider, or they're not unhappy with their current provider and they're trying to figure out how to get they're just trying to get the best proposal and pricing they can from you. So that's where it's all about the language you use becomes a pretty powerful part of the concept.
And consultative selling has been around for about 30 years or more, where you probe first and listen first and show product last, or not at all. And this is the ultimate level of consultative selling. I mean, this is the highest level of it put into practice.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, let's kind of shift gears and talk about, we won't have time, obviously, to talk about all of the different areas, but I'm going to give you 4 practical examples of the 22 that we have in this. And let me put a little commercial in here. One of my goals and our goals is to create what I'll call a community of practice, a community of selling professionals or business development professionals that kind of embrace this concept of unselling. And I would hope that we'll share ideas and we'll end up with 250 instead of 22 of these ideas, because I think the more we do this, the better job we do of selling and serving our clients in the process. So number 1, my commercial, my challenge to everybody out there is, don't conform to the client's buying and evaluation and decision process. I believe one of the best ways you can use your leverage in the early part of the buying and selling process is to actually add value. But it takes a bit of a mindset change. It takes a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift is, I'll share with you the same question I share with most of the workshops I conduct. And I'll say to a team of people, who is better at defining a specific set of steps and knows how to involve the right kinds of people and can define the right criteria to ultimately choose the best solution, us or the customer? And if that takes you more than a nanosecond to decide that we are far more qualified to do that, I'm going to, again, challenge your thinking to say the reason we're more qualified, we do it for a living, we've dealt with, in some cases, hundreds of clients, we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we've learned a tremendous amount about how a client can go through an intelligent process to ultimately choose the best solution. And if we don't add that value, if we don't challenge their thinking, if we don't, I guess the worst of all worlds is if a client came to you and said, tell me, Peter, how should I go about this? Because I really haven't done this before. How would this work? Shame on us and shame on me if I say, well, that's a good question. Let me think about it and get back to you. The reality is that is one of your best opportunities. And even if they don't ask, I think we have an opportunity to at least probe a little bit on, have you thought about what steps you're going to take? And when they share with us the 4 steps they've defined, then I think our responsibility, our obligation is to actually add value at that moment so that they know that you're more than just here to talk about demonstrations and products and features and functions, that we can literally add value to their process.
Yeah, at some point you have to do turn from consultative to prescriptive. But if you do it on their process, then you're really staying on that consulting level.
That's exactly right. And I would argue it primarily benefits them. It secondarily benefits us. And here's the cool thing, is if you do it well and you give them the right steps and the right criteria, you can actually do a wonderful job of exposing the competitor's weaknesses.
Absolutely.
Without disparaging them, which is kind of the secret sauce, if you will. Okay, so that's a simple kind of concept, easy to say. It takes a real professional, and I'll call it an unselling professional, to do it well. Let's go to the next one. I couldn't feel more strongly about this concept of discovery is not optional. And let me explain further what I mean by discovery is not optional. How many times has anybody on this call gotten what I call the blind RFP, right? And you have, it's very prescriptive, it's 75 pages long, we'd love for you to participate. You find out they've invited 13 other vendors. You've got 7 days to respond, no access to people, no access to information. Good luck and good selling, right? Now, the average organization struggles mightily to not respond to that deal. And they may even call the key procurement contact, right, who's at what I affectionately refer to as the plankton level, right? And say, boy, we really need more information. And the client says, no, we can't give you any information because we need to keep this a perfectly level playing field with you and the other 12 competitors. Well, let me tell you why I think that's selling malpractice. And I'll give you an example that comes from the medical world. It's akin to a patient walking into a doctor's office and saying, doctor, I'm really ill. I'm feeling really bad and I need some medicine. And the doctor, seeing the patient and seeing the shade of gray that you are, says, well, happy to help. Can you tell me what's wrong? What do you feel like? And you say, well, doc, I can't really tell you that. I just need some medicine. Well, that would be medical malpractice. And yet, what happens to us in a traditional selling environment? We go to a client, we say, hey, we saw this big requirements document, and it obviously contains a lot of information, but to really understand the problem you're trying to solve, I'm going to need your help, and I'm going to need some access to key people, and I'm going to need some information, and I'll clearly need more time. And yet when the client says, no, can't do that, we need to keep this a level playing field, we basically go ahead and prescribe the medicine. We give them a proposal. We think that's actually going to do a good job of differentiating ourselves, and I actually think it's the opposite. I think you give them the opportunity to paint us with a brush that we're generic and we don't understand their business, and that's the sin in my mind.
Yeah, and this process works a lot better with executives than it does with procurement.
Yes, it does. You're exactly right. So you got to be thoughtful about who you use it with and how you choose it. But here's another contention I would give you on this notion is if they're not willing, let's say access for an example. And of course, I feel strongly that the worst thing in the world a great business developer could do is ask for permission for access. Because when you ask for permission, what you're basically inviting is a no. So a great, I think back to my Accenture days, great consultative selling people, partners, et cetera, they would go to a client and say, happy to help. In order to help you, in order to add value, in order to really, really demonstrate and maybe even challenge your paradigms and your thinking about the problem you're trying to solve, I'm going to need the following. And if the client's not willing to do that, what they're basically communicating to us is we don't really want you, but we do need you, right? And that's what we're trying to ferret out early in the process.
Yeah, we found that the research shows that 27% of deals are lost to competition. A lot of those were already decided before you got there. You were calling B and C the whole time and just didn't, you took a bullet early. You didn't know to die and fall down. I mean, many of these things are they pretty well know who they're going to decide from before they start. And Sarbanes-Oxley says they still got to put it out for bid. So a lot of these RFPs are already decided before we start.
And that was the aha for me, Rick, back many years ago when you particularly when you do win and loss reviews and you figure out that the client has really made everybody believe that they're in good shape and they're going to win this deal. And that's what lulls us into a sense of complacency that I think can be very expensive, both personally and professionally for all of us. So let me shift gears to the third example. And the reason I love this example, and it comes from a lot of the work I've done in the consulting environment, is when I coach consulting teams, one of the questions I usually ask the team, and you have to know I have a bias that consulting people have one of the most difficult jobs in the world because unlike some product environments where you have a turnkey solution and you have features and functions and it's very demonstrable and it's actually easy for the client to feel and touch, in a consulting environment it's fairly amorphous. And so I'll say to a team, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you look at this $15 million project that the client is embarking on over the next 12 months, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being easy and 10 being difficult, maybe impossible, where is this project? How hard is it going to be for the client to be on time, on budget, and achieve their objectives? And the funny thing is, in the vast majority of cases, consulting people and teams will say, this is going to be a 9 or a 10. This is going to be heavy lifting. Or to say it another way, this is going to be rocket science. Now, if you kind of buy into that concept, and I believe in a lot of the environments and the clients that we serve, Rick, are high-tech consulting, it's not easy to be successful on time, on budget. And yet, if 5 selling teams are dealing with a prospect, what are they all trying to make the client believe? That this is a piece of cake. Look at our qualifications. We've done this 75 times before. Yours will be just as easy. We'll be on time, we'll be on budget, and you have no risks. Now, that's a brilliant strategy until the client concludes that, well, if I'm being told by 5 credible firms that this is a piece of cake, what I'm basically advantaging, the one party I'm most advantaging is the low-cost provider. And when I advantage the low-cost provider, and then the reality is, the reason we're trying to make it easy is we're trying to differentiate ourselves. And I believe that we're doing the exact opposite. And if the client is embarking on something difficult, what my coaching to teams is, I think we have a responsibility to be credibly articulating where are the common points of failure, based on our assessment, where are they going to struggle and why, not to make it sound impossible, because a key message that you don't want to deliver to a client is, this is going to be pretty much impossible, good luck and good choosing. That won't work. But what you can say is, this is going to be difficult, and the reasons are A, B, C, and D. And let me tell you what you have to do to mitigate that. And I'll share one other kind of vignette on this. When I was at IBM for 7 years, I spent 7 months in sales training at IBM, and I learned one thing in spades, and that is what we call fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD factor. And IBM sold based on creating, if you could get the client to embrace the notion that this is actually going to be a difficult project, it actually advantaged IBM because they saw us as the safe solution. Well, my advice to everybody on the phone is, and to anybody who's out there in business development land, is if the client is embarking on something difficult, then I think we have both an obligation and an opportunity to differentiate ourselves because we're the ones who actually tell them the truth and explain some of the difficulties.
And the issue of risk and strategic impact is really something that can help you get to executives, because one is it has strategic benefits. You need to talk to strategic buyers, which would be above procurement. Second thing is, they need to understand the level of commitment from top executives, and you as a seller have a fiduciary relationship with your own company.
That's right.
To invest in prospects that have a chance of buying and are going to make the commitment that it takes to make this successful. And you can only get that from executives. So if you get, maybe one way is to get beyond the scope of the procurement people is to say, this is just not going to work if we don't have the commitment of top executives, because it really impacts them, and we all want them to be happy, don't we?
That's right. This is all about your success, not my success, not my win, but I want you to be successful. That's a great, and I think we could put some fear in that process that says if you don't, then you're at risk, right, in that process. So now let me take the fourth one, the final example, and I call it accelerating perfectly illogical discussions. And I'm going to give you an example that is probably one of the best examples I can point to, and it's a client I deal with. I won't mention the client, but we probably have some of them on our call so they'll know who they are. But they actually sell a really, really powerful solution into a hospital. And one of the things we've done is we've defined what you'd call a best practice sales process for this sales force. And we've taken some of the most experienced salespeople in this organization, and we've kind of facilitated a process to have them map out what they should be doing at every stage of a 7-stage sales process. And of course, Rick, you and I both know that when a sales organization knows what the roadmap to success is, and you get everybody executing that commonly, then we win a lot more in the process. Well, here's a fascinating thing that this client basically came up with in this process is, of the 7 stages, when we got these, it was about 10 of their most successful salespeople. At stage 2, the vast majority of these salespeople in that room that day said, you know what, Peter, one of the things we have to build into this is in the early part of the process, probably right after qualification, or maybe even at the tail end of qualification, we ought to be covering with the client a prototypical implementation plan. And of course, the average selling person, the average person who's been trained in traditional selling concepts says, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you cover a prototypical implementation plan at stage 2? Aren't you being presumptive? Aren't you going to make the client angry? Because no, the answer is what you do is you basically say, let's steal a term I used a few minutes ago. Regardless of who you choose, regardless of what you do and what path you choose, would it be helpful if we sat down and got a few of the right people in a room to kind of think through what are all the things you have to get right in order to be successful regardless of what solution you choose? What it does, and what they have found in spades, is it clarifies who ought to be involved. It determines whether they have the intestinal fortitude to actually are serious enough about doing this to get the right people in the room. And you really do help determine whether this is a fishing expedition or they're serious about getting something done. So that's an example of, if you accelerate some discussions and some, again, perfectly illogical kinds of topics, you will really gain credibility, build relationship, gain access, and help qualify the deal all at the same time.
Yeah, and if they're leaning your way, this can move them over into a very subtle type of close, which is, now we're talking about how we're going to do this rather than if and who we're going to do it with. And if they bite on that and start talking about how we're going to deploy, then you've moved them along without really being overt.
Without being selling, right?
You just shifted pronouns is what you've done from them and if to us and now.
That's exactly right. So let me see if I can, those are the four that again, you'll see lots of other examples, and of course I would love to hear many of you who have probably 50 other or 100 other examples to share those, because we'll try to proliferate that amongst this community of salespeople. But let me see if I can summarize and kind of wrap up a few things, and we'll see what questions have come up, if any, that we can address. So you know you have it right when things like the client invites your input. When you start to become a bit of a trusted advisor, and the reason they tend to invite your input is because they're not worried about you being a hammer looking for a nail. They know that if they invite you to a meeting and we have an open dialogue about steps that they're considering taking, you're not going to take a subjective approach to the world. You're genuinely going to try to help them figure out what to do. They share openly. They're willing to talk about the competition. They're willing to talk about some of the things they're worried about what constitutes success and those kinds of things. Then on the other side of that equation, we share the whole truth. And we aren't holding back kind of things that we think are critical for them to understand. And what we recognize is that when we tell them the truth, we actually build credibility and build trust, as opposed to making them worried that they won't be successful. And our focus shifts from how can I win the deal to how can I ensure the client is successful. And I can tell you, in fact, let me give you one last vignette, and then we'll wrap up. And that is, somebody told me recently, I was doing a speech on this topic, and a woman raised her hand and said, let me give you a simple example. I walked into a car repair shop recently, and she said, Peter, you have to know women aren't treated as well as they should be at car repair shops. And I had somebody look at my car, and for the first time in my adult life, the guy came back to me and said, you know what, you have a problem, and it's probably a $900 problem to solve, but honestly, it's not going to hurt anything if you just don't do anything, and if I were you, I wouldn't spend that money. And she said to me that day, she said, Peter, I'll never go to another car repair shop in my life. And that's another example of tell the client the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and you will win clients for life. Forever. That's right. That's exactly right. So let me just kind of share one other thing, and we'll see. I'll turn it back over to David and see if we have any questions or any wrap-up comments. And that is, please know that you're going to get an email later today. You may even gotten it simultaneous to this webcast. That's going to give you instructions for how to get a copy of the ebook, and it comes in multiple formats: PDF. We have it on Kindle. We have it on the Sony book reader, and there's actually a couple of other kinds of reading devices that you can get it. And the only caveat I give you is on Kindle, we couldn't find a way to view it for free, so you're going to have to pay a whopping 99 cents. We apologize if that's unaffordable. Send me the bill. I got to be careful what I say that when So please know that that's coming. We would love to proliferate this concept. We'd love for you to share your ideas on how to do this well, or successes, or quite honestly, if it doesn't work and you get thrown out of somebody's office, please send me an email. I'd love to kind of incorporate that into what we're learning about this process. And we just have a motivation to get more people who sell far more consultatively than the traditional dash to the demo kind of selling. And so I'm delighted we had the opportunity today. And David, I'm curious, do we have any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, Peter, we do. But by the way, great content. I'm sure everybody has gotten a tremendous value out of this. We've got several questions. I don't know if we have time to get to all of them. But again, for any of you that have submitted questions, please don't hesitate to follow up with us by email. We're certainly glad to follow back up with it. But let me start with one, which I think is a great question. Someone says, what advice do you have for someone like me, who I don't consider myself a salesperson, but I'm in a role where I have to sell?
I got great news for that person and a whole bunch of people. It's funny, since I've really kind of focused on this topic and we've been sharing the content, I'm amazed, David, how many people out there are actually in selling roles, but they've never thought of themselves as salespeople. And therefore, the whole notion is kind of uncomfortable, because I think the reputation sometimes we salespeople get is the slick car salesman and the trial close, and hey, if I can get it in this color, will you order it today? And the good news from my standpoint is, if you'll read this content if you embrace this notion, what you'll find is this is actually liberating. And I have some key consulting-related clients. They love this stuff because it takes them out of that category of the slick salesperson.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of those images we have of bad selling come from salespeople that want to sell you one thing one time and disappear. That's not repeat business selling that we're talking about. And first thing you do is take those away. And then if you define it as solving and serving, fits right in with the mindset of how this works.
Yeah, and I think also, I think it's a really great point because a lot of organizations are trying to create more of a sales culture within their company. And part of what they're fighting is this mindset that their non-sales, pure salespeople have about the salesperson. I was with a client last week, and one of the executives of their service organization says, we're trying to create this everybody's in sales mentality.
Right.
But there's resistance or there's hesitation just because they don't consider themselves salespeople and they don't necessarily know the approach to take.
Yeah, sales support people, for example, love this concept.
Yeah.
And because it feels a lot more comfortable, it feels a lot more consultative.
Consultants without a product to sell love this approach.
Right, exactly.
Another question, kind of a two-part question that came in about when you were speaking about the RFPs. So someone was very intrigued and said, just would you state again what you have found to be more the purpose of the RFP, not to find the best solution, but what your experience has been about what it really is.
Oh, great. I love to have a healthy debate on this topic because anytime I kind of, in a speech or in a workshop, I'll say the purpose of an RFP, in my experience, and this is proven out so many times, I'll go to my death arguing this. The purpose of the average RFP is not designed to choose the best solution. It is designed to prove by the end of the process that whoever I or our team intended to choose, in other words, whoever we have a preference for at the beginning, we actually end up being able to choose that vendor at the end. And the more you understand about the Death Valley Sales Canyon, you'll understand, anybody would understand more about why that logic works the way it does. But the reality is, and even procurement people will tell you, I had a CIO I won't even tell you the state, of one of the states in the union, tell me a couple of years ago, sheepishly in a workshop when I made that statement, hey, I've done 11 major procurements in our state, in the IT realm, in the last 3 years before I left the state. Not once did we end up choosing anybody other than who we intended to choose. And that's the premise that a healthy skeptic needs to embrace if you're going to be an unselling professional.
And we love to hear that when it comes from someone who was on that side of the table,
Bingo.
right? It validates what we know. And so here's a second question that's related, and I think it really will be relevant for the audience. So understanding that and knowing that really what we're talking about is not just unselling as an approach, but we're really talking about how can we change the game of the process that the client's going through. So someone else says, well, if the executives aren't willing to meet, but they're not willing to meet with anyone, the best we can tell, should you still walk away?
Well, here's what I would say. If they're not willing to meet with anyone and you have what I call unencumbered by the facts, right? So you don't really know any other information, you don't know their biases or anything else, if it takes you almost no effort to respond and you can lob in a generic proposal and therefore your cost of sales is negligible, it's kind of like playing a poker game, right? And if everybody checks and I don't have to pay any money to see the next card, I'm delighted to stay in the game. But if it's going to take you 17 man-weeks of effort to put together a proposal, I can remember having a ferocious debate with a leadership partner in Accenture as to whether or not we should, literally do a proposal for Coca-Cola Company. And I almost lost my job over that ferocious debate. My point is, unencumbered by the facts, we don't have a chance of winning. And the reality is we didn't.
Right.
So my honest answer is, if it's zero cost of sales, fine. If it's a heavy cost of sales, I would not spend my time there.
The other thing is we don't get paid to be busy. We get paid to win in the end.
Right.
And the second thing is, early in the process, if you walk away from a deal, they may come back after you. I've seen that happen a lot. If you do that late in the game or after you've shot your bolt with your demo and your presentation and you walk away then, it's too late. They say, bye, sore loser. But early in, when they really want you in and gather your information, keep you in the game, it has a much better chance of winning or leveling the playing field where you can get steps in the process that you need to be successful.
And Peter, going back to your point, I think it is good because what we're talking about, and Rick has said this many, many times, is we're not necessarily qualifying out and walking away, but we're not committing to them. We're saying, what's the cost of the next card?
That's right.
In poker analogy, right? So if we can determine that, we're going to buy the next card, given what we know at this point.
Sure.
Which is a great point because let's take that next step and find out.
But the likelihood of somebody's proposal being so good and so well articulated that it differentiates you is nearly non-existent.
And what's the odds that they actually read them all, right?
Non-existent.
Exactly. So, okay. Well, we've got several more, but we're about to run out of time here. So we'll go to a wrap-up. But, Peter, I want to say thank you so much for being with Rick and I today. And, again, for those of you that attended, we thank you for your time. You'll be getting an email, as Peter mentioned, with an opportunity to get a copy of today's webinar, recorded copy, as well as the free ebook if you want it in that format. And please do also follow up with any questions that you might have. Let me go ahead and quickly mention our next webinar, which is going to be in August. And I think it's going to be somewhat related to this in the fact that it's another topic, I think, where salespeople can have some added tools in their bag to help them differentiate themselves. And we're going to be having Jill Conrath, speaker and author, who's going to be speaking to how to sell to crazy busy people. Okay, that's not busy people that are crazy, right? but those are like everybody in the world, the business world today. Crazy busy. They're inundated with way too much noise, way too many emails, voicemails, other things. How do we differentiate ourselves to get them to give us 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, to take the unselling approach, for example? So you'll be seeing a registration link coming out on that and information on our website. So thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in August.
Thanks, everybody.